we can feel very out of touch with the people in history, people 200 years ago, 300 years ago. Like we can almost feel like they didn't exist, or that these are just stories or myths that are told about what happened in this time period. But the reality is that we can almost sit beside them and hear their stories. And we can do that through books, firsthand accounts, stories about what's happening to these people. And then, if we really want to get in touch, we really want to get a feel for that, we can go to these living history sites. We can see these things portrayed. Today, I want to tell you a little bit more about the German soldiers that came over to fight during the Revolutionary War. Such a real interesting story about what happened in history, what happened to these soldiers. And the story is very, widely. We aren't told a lot about these kinds of things in high school. It's like, oh yeah, some German mercenaries came over during the war, and that's about it. We don't hear very much about them, about the soldiers themselves, and about the story and their hardships and what happened to them. What happened to them after the war? There's some great information available out there. I've got a couple of books I'm going to read from today. These stories are so poignant, and just about the idea about there being mercenaries. Probably most of these soldiers, they weren't really in the army voluntarily. They didn't ask to be sent over to America to fight in this war. And many of them didn't even want to be in the military. And they weren't specifically paid to come over here. So while they were mercenaries in one sense, they themselves, as soldiers, weren't being paid to come over and fight, other than being paid in their their food and their clothing, and that's about it. These German soldiers came over from 6 different distinct little, principalities within Germany at the time. Germany wasn't one cohesive country as we think of it, but as a bunch of little tiny sort of small principalities with their own individual princes. And 6 of these regions sold troops to the British Crown, they were behind the 8 ball. They needed to have troops over in North America right away to start fighting this rebellion. And so they went to the German princes, and they found about 30,000 troops that could be sent over to North America to fight. The first story that's incredible is the story of the way they get to North America in the first place. And probably a third or a half of the troops get sent over in the first year of the war, 1776. And apparently this trip over was just plain harrowing. It starts out, they leave anchor about May 6th or so from England, and they don't get to their final destination in North America until like August 11th or 12th. So they're in these ships for something like 3 months, and it sounds just terrible. Here's a little excerpt. They run into storms multiple times. Lots and lots of bad weather. The wind and waves became more violent from hour to hour during the night of the 25th to the 26th. The Commodore gave the signal to draw in all sails except one to remove the uppermost parts of the masts. The ships were being scattered far apart. In the cabins, all articles, though tied fast, were broken loose and thrown helter-skelter, the occupants likewise, with many bruised limbs. There was no end to the spells of seasickness, of misery made ridiculous. The storm was ever growing worse. On the second day, the last sail was drawn in. The rudder was bound fast, so that now the ship was left to its fate. The raging seas were playing with the gigantic structure of the ships as with toys. Sailors were swallowed up by the waters, others committed suicide, and the soldiers who ventured to go out on deck fell down unconscious because of the force of the waves. Not only did they have these storms, many times the ships were running into fog or other violent situations, and they smashed together, and they thought different ones were going to sink, and they had to pump the whole time that they were traveling. It was just horrible. And if you thought that the weather was bad, and that they were on the seas for a long time. They had this problem, and of course they had the typical problems with food. The supplies, because this was a fairly long voyage, the supplies ran out, and toward the end, they were down to partial rations. I think at one point he talks about they're down to 8 ounces of hardtack a day. It was really bad. There's a diary of a German poet, an adventurer, that he relates part of his time as one of these soldiers. Truly incredible. He says, the deck was so low that a grown man could not stand upright, and the bunks not high enough to sit in. The bunks were intended to hold 6 men each, but after 4 had entered, the remaining 2 could only find room by pressing in. He talks about the food. He says, today, bacon and peas and bacon tomorrow. Once in a while, this menu was broken by porridge or peeled barley, and as an occasional great feast, by pudding. This pudding was made of musty flour, half salt, half sweet water, and a very ancient mutton suet. The bacon could have been 4 to 5 years old, was black at both edges, became yellow a little further in, and white only in the very center. So you can imagine all these sailors, or all these soldiers on board these ships and the terrible time they had. There's a little section here where it talks about the Brunswickers. One of these areas, these little principalities, was Brunswick. And in February, or in 1776, this particular general set off with 2,282 men embarking, and within these 2,000 men, there were also 77 soldiers' wives that went along with the regiment. So it wasn't just these men, but also sometimes their wives. Not every one of these soldiers was unhappy to come over to North America. And Pops, in his journal, writes this little piece. This is February 2nd, 1777. Orders were issued that the regiment should be ready to take the field in 3 weeks. Colonel von Hoyt was assigned the command and directed to fill the ranks with young men from all the villages in the neighborhood. This excited the laments of fathers and mothers and families who came every day to bid farewell to their sons and brothers and friends. Some of the soldiers were glad, and I was of that number, for I had long wanted to see something of the world. Others were filled with grief and sorrow at leaving home, and there was on their side much sighing. So during this entire war period, about 30,000 men came over from Germany to North America to fight in the war. About 17,000 of them returned back to Germany after the war. So there's about 12,000 here that are, we have to figure out what happened to them. It looks like about 1,200 of them died during battle. About 6,500 of them died from illness or accident, and the remaining 5,000 deserted or stayed in North America in one way or the other. One of the projects that we've been working at here at Townsend's is bringing a few books into print that are helpful to people who are interested in these topics. In this volume, we bound together 3 books. The Hessians by Edward Lowell, The Voyage of the First Hessian Army, and at the very end of this book is Pop's journal, so that we get some little first-hand accounts of what's going on during the war. This is a book that is, 500 or 600 pages. Lots of great information. I've got a link down in the description section. This is a book that's available on Amazon right now. Such great stories. These folks in these past times, 200 and 300 years ago, they reach out and they want to talk to us. So all we have to do is listen. And they've got such wonderful stories. I'm really having a great time digging into these journals and these stories about these folks 200 and 300 years ago. It's wonderful. Thank you for coming along and joining me on this little journey back in history.